The Gesellschaft für interkulturelle Germanistik, Intercultural Germanics, was founded in 1984. The next year, the Society published a landmark collection of essays on Das Fremde und das Eigene. While there's some overlap between intercultural Germanics and transcultural German studies, the former flows into the latter. I will propose that transcultural German studies moves beyond intercultural Germanics in several ways, and we'll begin with a fundamental distinction in epistemology. Johann Martin Kladenius's theory of knowledge serves as one of the starting points of intercultural Germanics. This 18th century writer's Einleitung zur richtigen Anweisung vernünftiger Reden und Schriften, which appeared in Leipzig in 1742, has had a profound effect on hermeneutic studies, including the work of Hans-Georg Gadamer. In brief, Kladenius held that people have different perceptions of the same object. In his Einleitung, Kladenius defined his concept of a Sehpunkt, Sehepunkt, in terms of space and time as der Ort des Auges, which presupposes die Entfernung von einem Vorwurf. Each of us has his or her own image of something and no other. In short, no two people share the same point of view. And the reason for this is what Kladenius calls der Sehpunkt. Now, the founder of intercultural Germanics, Alois Wierlacher, adapts Kladenius when describing the other as das aufgefasste Auge. Instead of the term Sehpunkt, Wierlacher employs the word Blickwinkel, which he believes is an apt signifier of the complex condition and position of the human being, to whom one's history, ways of thinking, language, everyday knowledge, cultural memory, professional knowledge, knowledge of the world, and one's own cultural identity belong. For Wierlacher, there is an individual and a cultural plurality of points of view, Sichtweisen. In the end, intercultural Germanics is primarily interested in the encounters, in the Begegnungen between two or more cultures, which entails distance, and if encounter, then conflict. I propose that while appreciating Kladenius' theory of knowledge, transcultural German studies should draw upon the work of Johann Gottfried Herder. In his essay Vom Erkennen und Empfinden der menschlichen Seele, which was published in 1778, Herder argues that cognition is sparked by the inner state of the powers of sensation, which he terms der innere Sinn. For Herder, sense is more basic than sight for the advancement of knowledge. This point is particularly interesting in the light of Herder's determinations about far-off places around the world, about which he created knowledge of cultures other than his own, sight unseen, such as in his monumental work Ideen zur Philosophie der Geschichte der Menschheit. Whereas hermeneutics renders the unintelligible intelligible, so, with the aid of the inner sense, the imperceptible is made perceptible. Feeling is the most predominant of all human senses, for Herder, the most fundamental organ of the soul that collects perceptions in their external relations. In his writing Plastik, Herder goes so far as to argue that because Sinn surrounds the soul, it, der innere Sinn, is the very source of the true, the good, and the beautiful. Humanität cultivates the noble education, the edle Bildung of the human being, which develops the finer senses and lends our drives their purpose. In retrospect, because Kladenius valued reason above all else, he did not consider the possibility of shared experience. As Herder's essays suggest, shared experiences are cultivated through an organ of the inner sense, which is common to all human beings. It's an interesting fact that the German Romantic writer, Caroline von Günderode, shared Herder's idea of an inner sense. She even writes der innere Sinn, and in her own way sought to render what is imperceptible perceptible. An example of this, we could go into it in the discussion if you like, but an example is her short story, Günderode's short story, Geschichte eines Brahminen. Now, turning from the 18th to the 20th century, according to Wierlacher, intercultural Germanic shares with the hermeneuticist Hans-Georg Gadamer the idea that understanding Verstehen means to comprehend things differently. However, Wehrlacher does not share Gadamer's conviction that understanding presupposes content, that there is ein tragendes Einverständnis. Wehrlacher maintains that intercultural phenomena comprise a modus kooperativer Selbstaufklärung, since self-enlightenment itself first takes place through the self-distancing in self-conscious awareness of the other. In the final analysis, interculturality remains focused on the individual, Selbstaufklärung. The more vital question, however, goes unaddressed, namely, how does one live in community with others? Is it possible to gain a sense of and for community simply by recognizing and accepting differences? One of the practical values of transcultural German studies may well consist in the generation of common understandings and purposes that shared experiences create while respecting the authenticity of difference. I'll now move to transcultural studies and the theory. One of the leaders of that is Wolfgang Welsch, as you may know, is a professor of philosophy at Jena. It's kind of interesting right now that Welsch himself has taken a turn. He was really into transcultural, and now he's thinking, probably by virtue of his understanding of what transcultural is about, he's thinking about pre-cultural. So he's kind of morphed into an anthropologist, I think. As a foremost theoretician of transculturalism, Wolfgang Welsch sees that transcultural studies draws on one of the main currents of postmodernist thought. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, once wrote the following: Der eigentliche Wert und Sinn der jetzigen Kultur besteht in einem gegenseitigen sich verschmelzen und befruchten. According to Jacques Derrida, no culture is identical with itself. There is no culture and no cultural identity without difference or differences with itself. And Edouard Said holds that all cultures are hybrid in nature. No culture is pure, none is identical with the pure folk, and none consists of a homogeneous web of associations. And yet, is it not possible that difference can create some degree of commonality and perhaps a sense of common purpose? One of the central questions of transcultural studies consists in the following: what is the nature of the shared experiences of a transcultural space that results when, after initial encounters and conflict, cultures permeate each other? Are not these differences transformed, and if so, in what ways? Wolfgang Welsch argues that the study of culture must take into account the permeation of cultures, die gegenwärtige Durchdringung der Kulturen, and the external networks of cultures, die externen Vernetzungen der Kulturen. Theoreticians of transcultural studies understand cultures to be multidimensional, interactive, and porous. And in the interfacing of cultural, linguistic, literary, and social phenomena, transcultural third spaces emerge. Transcultural studies expand then on intercultural objects of study by moving beyond the encounter and opposition between one's own and a so-called foreign culture. As the German-Americanist in Köln, Heinz Antor, formulates it, die Idee, dass kulturelle wie individuelle Identität dialogisch formiert wird und sich so weiterentwickelt, führt zur Bildung eines Modells für das Aufeinandertreffen differenter Kulturen. For Antor, it is dialogue that first makes possible the initial contact between different positionings in the hybrid transcultural sphere. As I formulated it recently in German, die Hauptmerkmale transkultureller Räume bestehen erstens aus der gegenseitigen, wechselwirkenden Interaktion verschiedener kultureller Elemente und zweitens in der Transformation von zwei oder mehr Kulturen in ausgeweiteten Identitäten, während diese Kulturen ihre authentischen Grundformen behalten.